Hi, everybody. Before we get started, one quick reminder, which is that exam 2 is 1 week from today. Okay, so that's next Tuesday. That's March 2nd. You are responsible for everything from the last exam up until the end of what we cover on Thursday's class. So I'm not sure, we probably won't get the whole way through the cognitive dissonance section. We're going to finish attitudes today. We're going to start a new topic, cognitive dissonance. We probably won't get through everything as of the end of Thursday, but whatever we get to, that's what you're responsible for exam 2. And of course, it's, as I said, it's non-cumulative. So it's only material that we've talked about since exam 1 that you're responsible for. It's going to be the same format as exam 1, 30 multiple choice questions. And as usual, I will post a study guide for exam 2. And of course, all the lectures are links to the Zoom, links to the Zoom lectures, which are posted on YouTube, are on Canvas as well. So if you miss any lectures, make sure to catch up on those. And of course, we're going to take exam 2 using TopHat, just like we did before. Okay, with that said, we've got to finish talking about attitudes. So let's turn to that now. And when we left off, we were going to address basically a common assumption in social psychology, which is that attitudes predict behaviors. And because predicting behavior is one of the main goals we have as social psychologists, then the idea is that if you know someone's attitudes, that allows you to predict their behavior. But as I mentioned at the very end of last class, a researcher by the name of Alan Wicker in the 1960s basically looked at all the literature, looking at the relationship between people's attitudes and their behaviors, and found that in fact attitudes don't seem to be related to behaviors at all. And this was quite a conundrum. How do we reconcile this idea that research apparently shows no relationship between attitudes and behaviors at all? And one of the studies I had mentioned, or that I briefly described, that indicated this sort of lack of relationship between attitudes and behaviors was a study where a researcher, Lapierre, took a Chinese couple around a bunch of different campgrounds and restaurants and hotels around the country at a time when there was widespread discrimination against the Chinese. And although they were served over 99% of the time, they were only refused service a single time. When he later sent a questionnaire to the owners of these establishments, over 90% of them said that they would refuse service. So we have a situation where people's attitudes are that they're stating, I will not serve this person, but their behavior is that they did actually serve that person. So this is one of the types of studies that seems to show a lack of a relationship between people's stated attitudes and their subsequent behaviors. So these types of studies led to a whole bunch of research in the 1970s looking at the conditions under which attitudes predict behaviors. Because it turns out that under some conditions, attitudes are very strongly linked to behaviors. And under other conditions, attitudes and behaviors are not very strongly linked at all. So what I want to spend the rest of this section talking about is on what are the conditions under which attitudes and behaviors are related to one another. We're going to talk about four conditions. And the first condition, which is one of the most important ones, is that in order for an attitude to be related to someone's behavior, they have to be measured at the same level of specificity. Okay? In other words, the attitude and the behavior have to correspond in terms of how specific they are. If they don't correspond, then attitudes don't predict behaviors very well. Now, this is probably better explained by using an example. So I'm going to give you an example from a study where they they measured women's attitudes towards using birth control, and they related that to their behaviors about whether they actually use birth control pills in the following 2 years. So here's the basic idea. So what I'm going to list on the left-hand side are 4 different versions of a question that the researchers asked different groups of women that was measuring their attitudes. And in the right-hand column, this R column, R stands for correlation coefficient. And we talked about correlation coefficients earlier this semester. Just remember that the closer this correlation coefficient is to 1, the stronger the relationship. The closer it is to 0, the weaker the relationship. And so basically, this is correlating people's stated attitudes with their later behaviors. So we're going to see if there's a relationship there at all. Okay, so let me tell you how this study worked. So what the researchers did is they asked a group of women the following question. what is your attitude towards birth control? Okay. So women either gave a positive attitude, negative attitude, whatever it was. And then they asked, or they found out if these women used birth control pills over the previous 2 years. And they correlated women's responses to this attitude question to their behavior. Now, if you notice, this is a very general attitude, right? What's your attitude towards birth control? It doesn't specify what kind of birth control, it doesn't specify whether you are the one using the birth control. It's a very, very general question, right? And the idea here is that when you measure people's general attitudes, and then you measure their very specific behaviors. So they're measuring whether women themselves use birth control pills over the next 2 years. That's a very specific behavior. When you have a general attitude and a specific behavior, when they don't match, when they don't correspond, you don't find much of a relationship. And indeed, when you correlate women's attitudes with that behavior, what you find is a very, very weak relationship. This is very close to zero. And so therefore, that means there's a very weak relationship between attitudes and behaviors. So the researchers asked a different group of women a slightly more specific question. What is your attitude towards birth control pills? Now, this is a more specific question, and it brings it more in line with the behavior that they're measuring. Okay. And when you get women's responses to this more specific question, the correlation goes up. So now what we're seeing is that women's attitudes do predict their behaviors a little bit. It's not a really strong relationship, it's only 0.3, but it's still somewhat predictive of their actual behaviors of whether they would use birth control pills in the next 2 years. So the researchers asked a third group of women, what is your attitude towards you yourself using birth control pills? Again, it's a more specific version of women's attitudes that brings it more in line with that behavior. And again, what we see is the correlation goes up. And now we're seeing a decently sized correlation of 0.5. Finally, researchers asked a fourth group of women the most specific question. What is your attitude towards using birth control pills during the next 2 years? Now, that attitude question brings it directly in line with the behavior that they're actually measuring, which is whether the women are using birth control pills in the next 2 years. And so when you measure attitudes at the same level of the behavior, that's when you get the highest relationship, 0.57. Okay. So what was happening is that in a lot of the early studies in social psychology, the studies that led Alan Wicker to conclude that there was no relationship between attitudes and behaviors, what those studies had done is they had asked people a very general attitude question, which is basically analogous to ask them this question here. What's people's attitudes towards birth control? And then they correlated that with people's very, very specific behaviors. And as we're seeing, when you do that, you don't get much of a relationship. So for instance, a study might have measured people's attitudes towards religion and then measured whether they went to church and then found very little relationship. Well, that's because measuring people's attitudes towards religion is a very, very general question, and measuring whether they go to church is a very specific behavior. They didn't correspond very well, so you don't find much of a relationship. Theoretically, if you were to ask people, what is your attitude towards going to church, and then measure the behavior of whether they went to church, then you would find a more significant relationship, a stronger relationship between those two things. So this is maybe the most important point to take away here, is that if we want attitudes to predict behaviors, we have to measure them at the same level of specificity. Okay, so that's one condition under which attitudes, or one necessary condition for attitudes to predict behaviors. A second necessary condition is something called aggregation. Now, because we're a little bit behind in this class, I'm actually going to skip over an in-depth discussion of this point. So the next slide actually goes into this idea in a lot more depth, but there's a whole lot of detail and it's kind of statistical and it's kind of boring, and I'm not going to ask any questions about it anyway on the exam. So in order to catch up a little bit, I'm going to skip over this section. Just know that the basic idea here is kind of the same as the first point. The basic idea here is that if you're using a general attitude, as we just talked about, you can't use a general attitude to predict a specific behavior, right? But what you can do is you can use a general attitude to predict a whole bunch of different behaviors combined together or aggregated together. That's all this principle is saying. But as I said, you're not going to need to know this for the exam, so I'm just going to skip over this for now. Okay, so you can ignore the slide in your notes that has all those stats and the correlation coefficients that I didn't go over. A third condition under which attitudes predict behavior is when you remove social influence. So technically, I should probably say in this slide something like the absence of social influence. So for example, let's say that what I'm interested in is your attitudes or your prejudicial attitudes towards people of other races or other cultures. And if I asked you this in a group setting in front of other people, there's a very good chance that, well, you recognize that it's not socially acceptable to have these negative, these discriminatory views against people of other races. So you might lie to me. So instead of saying that, yeah, you don't like people of other races, what you might do is say, no, you're completely fair-minded. And so you're lying to me. And so what that means is that the attitude that you're giving me is not going to be related to your behaviors because you lied. You didn't give me the correct attitude. And the reason you didn't give me your correct attitude is because you responded in public. And so if I want to know what your true attitude is, I should not have you respond to attitude questions in public because you might lie to me. We saw this before when we looked at the social desirability bias, the tendency to want to appear like you're a good person. And that social desirability bias can lead you to answer in ways that you wouldn't otherwise. It can change the way that you answer. You may lie about your true attitudes, in other words. So what we need as researchers, if we want to know what people's true attitudes are, we need to remove all the social influence. And one way that researchers have come up with, which is kind of interesting, as a way to remove social influence, or I should say as a way to get people to lie less, is to use what's called a bogus pipeline. And a bogus pipeline is basically like a fake lie detector test. So in other words, the idea here is that you hook people up to what they believe is a lie detector, but in fact, it doesn't do any such thing. But as long as they're hooked up to what they think is a lie detector, they're not going to lie anymore, because what would be the point of lying? If they believe this detector can detect their lies, then there would be no point in lying, right? So as a consequence, people are going to tend to be more truthful when they're hooked up to this sort of bogus pipeline. And if they're more truthful, they're giving you their true attitudes, then those attitudes should relate to their behaviors more often. Okay, so the idea here is that if we want attitudes to predict behaviors, we have to ask people what their attitudes are in a context in which we've removed social influence, in a context in which we discourage them from lying, in other words. Finally, attitudes are much more likely to predict behaviors when those attitudes are stronger. So for instance, maybe it's the case that you like Pepsi more than Coke, and you have a really, really strong preference, right? Like you love Pepsi and Coke makes you want to throw up, okay? Well, you have a really strong preference, right? So if you go to the grocery store, I can predict with very high confidence that you're going to buy Pepsi and you're not going to buy Coke. Okay? And I'd be right a lot of the time because your attitude would predict your behavior when you have really strong attitudes. But let's say that you prefer Pepsi over Coke, but it's just a tiny difference. You have almost no preference. You just have a tiny slight preference for Pepsi over Coke. Now, I might predict that you're going to buy Pepsi at the grocery store. But maybe when you go to the grocery store, when you get there, you find that Coke is on sale. And if Coke is on sale, you're willing to buy Coke over Pepsi because you barely had a preference anyway. So in that case, what happened is that your attitude, which is that you prefer Pepsi, did not predict your behavior, which is that you bought Coke, because it wasn't a very strong attitude. And so other things came in and influenced your decision to buy Pepsi or Coke, which is like the sale. Okay. So strong attitudes predict behaviors quite well, but weak attitudes don't really predict people's behavior very well. Okay. So it is the case, fortunately for social psychologists, it is the case that attitudes do predict behaviors under these conditions. So you have to measure the attitude at the same level of specificity as the behavior. If you're using a general attitude, it doesn't predict specific behaviors very well. You have to aggregate those behaviors all together. That's the principle of aggregation, which, as I said, we didn't really cover, so don't worry about that too much. Attitudes predict behaviors if people are honest about them and you remove social influence. And attitudes predict behaviors if those attitudes are strong, but not so much if they're weak. Okay, but so far in discussing the relationship between attitudes and behaviors, we've operated under this certain assumption, which is that when you have an attitude, that attitude will then lead you or will then affect the later behaviors that you have. And this is the normal way that we think of the attitude-behavior relationship. The attitude comes first and the behavior comes second. The behavior is consistent with that pre-existing attitude. But in the 1950s and 1960s, a researcher by the name of Leon Festinger, who you've actually heard about before, or at least you've heard about his theories before, because he's also the same guy who came up with social comparison theory. He's a hugely influential social psychologist in the 50s. He said that Certainly it's the case that attitudes can lead to behaviors. But he also said that that directional relationship can sometimes be reversed. In other words, we can sometimes engage in behaviors and then we develop attitudes to be consistent with the behaviors that we've already engaged in. So not only do attitudes lead to behaviors, but the behaviors we engage in can also lead to our attitudes. And in particular, he framed this idea within the context of what he called cognitive dissonance theory. Cognitive dissonance theory is maybe the first or second most popular theory in all of social psychology. There have been hundreds of studies that have been conducted looking at various implications of cognitive dissonance theory, because it can explain a whole wide range of behavior. It has really, it's really powerful in terms of what it can explain, and it makes a lot of predictions, which is what a good theory does, which we talked about before. So I want to describe to you what cognitive dissonance theory is to give you an appreciation of this. And this is something, by the way, that you've experienced many, many times in your life, and people you know have experienced many, many times in your life. So as I talk about this theory, I want you to think about instances in the past in which you might have experienced these ideas yourself. Okay, here's the basic idea behind cognitive dissonance theory. We have a lot of attitudes and beliefs and thoughts and behaviors that we engage in. And for the most part, we'd like those things to be consistent with one another. So for instance, if you are against, let's say, cheating, you take a very strong stance against cheating, and you were to cheat on next week's test, well, that behavior is not very consistent with your attitude, right? It's pretty hypocritical, in other words. And we don't like that. We don't like to be inconsistent. In fact, what happens is that when there are discrepancies between the attitudes that we have and the behaviors that we engage in, that produces an aversive arousal. That aversive arousal, that unpleasant feeling that we get when we act like hypocrites, is known as cognitive dissonance. Okay? The name cognitive dissonance means there's two cognitive elements, or that can be an attitude and a belief, or in this case, we're looking at discrepancies between an attitude and a behavior. That's usually how it's framed. And they're dissonant, meaning they don't match. Okay? There's a discrepancy between the two. So what this means is we normally try to avoid those discrepancies between our attitudes and our beliefs and our behaviors, but we can't always avoid them. There are many, many instances in which we will act in a way that contradicts our beliefs or contradicts our attitudes. So we experience this unpleasant feeling, this cognitive dissonance. And we don't like that. We don't like that feeling. So what that means is we are motivated to try to get rid of that uncomfortable feeling, or to try to reduce our cognitive dissonance. And so cognitive dissonance theory is all about the ways that we have, the psychological strategies that we have to reduce the cognitive dissonance that arises when we behave in ways that conflict with our pre-existing attitudes or our pre-existing beliefs. I'm going to give you a list. This is a non-exhaustive list. There are other dissonance reduction strategies as well. But each of these 5 strategies I'm about to show you is one psychological strategy that we have to try to reduce cognitive dissonance. Okay. There's a question, does this happen when we try to please others? So sort of, there's a relationship between cognitive dissonance and something that you are getting at. So what you're getting at is something called impression management, which is when we try to change what other people think about us to some extent. There's a relationship there, but I can't really get into it without sort of laying out what cognitive dissonance theory says. So I might come back to that idea later on. So if you have the question later on, bring it up again later. But let me go through cognitive dissonance theory first. It's a little bit different. Because cognitive dissonance arises when it's our own behaviors that conflict with our own beliefs, even if there's no one present, even if there's no other person to observe us engaging in that behavior, we can still experience cognitive dissonance because dissonance is between our own attitudes and our own behaviors. Okay, so let's take a hypothetical as we walk through this, okay? So let's imagine that you consider yourself to be a really healthy person, okay? You work out and you try to eat well, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a really important belief to you, okay? You're a really healthy person. And yet you also smoke cigarettes a lot, okay? So what we have here is an attitude, which is I think I'm a healthy person, and a behavior, which is I smoke cigarettes, which is probably not the healthiest thing that you can do, right? So you've got a discrepancy between your attitude and your behavior. And the question is, if you were to be faced with this discrepancy, then how that would create this cognitive dissonance, right? That would be uncomfortable, and you'd want to try to reduce that dissonance. So let's look at 5 different ways you might reduce that cognitive dissonance. Well, the 2 most obvious strategies have to do with the directly addressing the discrepancy between your attitude and your behavior. So if that discrepancy is what's causing you discomfort, then one easy thing to do is you can change your attitude to bring it in line with your behavior. And there's a couple of ways that you can do that in this example. So you can change your attitude by concluding, you know what, I'm not really that healthy a person. That's one way to change your attitude. Or you can change your attitude about the consequences of smoking. So you can convince yourself that, you know what, the studies that have looked at smoking have mostly used animal models like rats and things, not humans. You can't randomly assign people to smoke or not for ethical reasons. So you can't do the proper experiments with humans. So as a consequence, we don't really have good research on this. You know what? I don't really believe that research. So smoking really isn't unhealthy. And if you can convince yourself that smoking isn't unhealthy, then suddenly your behavior, smoking, is no longer in conflict with your attitude, which is that you're a healthy person. Okay. So that's one strategy that we might have, is changing our attitude to match our behaviors. And one theme that you're going to see as we go through some of these mechanisms to reduce cognitive dissonance is that a lot of these, what we call dissonance reduction strategies, they're all ways to reduce your dissonance, so dissonance reduction strategies, a lot of them have to do with sort of lying to yourself or sort of deluding yourself a little bit. It's sort of ironic that in order to maintain consistency between our beliefs and our attitudes and our behaviors, we lie to ourselves to convince ourselves that in fact we're not being hypocrites, that in fact we are being actually consistent. And a lot of cognitive dissonance reduction strategies have to do with this sort of self-delusion that we engage in. Okay, so obviously we can change our attitude to bring it in line with our behavior, and that should reduce that discrepancy. It should therefore reduce cognitive dissonance. Of course, we don't just have to reduce our attitude or change our attitude to bring it in line with our behavior. We could change our behavior to bring it in line with our attitude. All right, that's the second strategy. We can change our behavior. So in this specific case, changing the behavior would be quitting smoking. I mean, after all, if you quit smoking, then you're no longer engaged in a behavior that conflicts with your attitudes. There's no longer any cognitive dissonance, right? So these first 2 strategies are the most obvious. It's just bringing an attitude in line with a behavior or bringing a behavior in line with an attitude. But the problem is that you might be able to see is that it's not necessarily easy to do either of these things. It's not necessarily easy to change your attitude and to convince yourself that smoking isn't unhealthy, because there is a whole lot of research and it's very firmly established that smoking is bad for your lungs. So it's kind of hard to delude yourself that much. Now, some people do it, but it's kind of hard for a lot of people to do it. So changing your attitude doesn't always work. And changing your behavior is nice in theory, but if you were a smoker for many years and you have an addiction to nicotine, it's not exactly the easiest thing to quit smoking either. And so people have developed other strategies, psychological strategies, to try to reduce their dissonance as well. So for instance, one strategy that people have is to add consonant cognitions. So a consonant cognition is a belief that is consistent with your behaviors, as opposed to a belief that's inconsistent with your behaviors. And the more consonant cognitions we add, the more it dilutes the dissonant cognition. But maybe this is better explained with an example. So for instance, what you might say is, well, yeah, I smoke, and yeah, I consider myself to be a healthy person, but you know what? Smoking suppresses my appetite. And because of that, it helps me lose weight. And losing weight is very consistent with the idea that I have that I'm a healthy person. Losing weight is good for me. So therefore, in a sense, smoking is good for me, right? So what you've done is you've added this new belief, in this case, smoking helps me lose weight, which is very much consistent with your attitude. So in a sense, it sort of bridges your attitude and your behavior. It sort of makes a connection to basically convince yourself that your behavior is not really that inconsistent with your attitudes, because it does have these positive health benefits in this case. Okay, so the idea here, though, is that this strategy has to do with adding a new belief that's consistent with both your attitude, in this case that I'm a healthy person, and your behavior, in this case that I'm smoking. A fourth strategy that we have is that what we might do is we might acknowledge that there is in fact a discrepancy between our attitude and our behavior. We might acknowledge that, yeah, I like to think I'm a healthy person and I do smoke and I do recognize that's discrepant. However, what we might do is we might say, but you know what? It's not really that important. In other words, I'm not like a massive hypocrite for this because you know what? We're all going to die someday anyway. I might as well enjoy myself. What this is doing is basically saying, yeah, I agree this discrepancy exists, but it doesn't really matter in the long run. I mean, if we're all going to die, then what does it really matter the behaviors we engage in when we're alive, right? So what does it really matter if I smoke a little bit? Even the healthiest person in the world is going to die. So it's not that big a deal. Or another example of this would be, well, a lot of people smoke and don't get cancer. So even though, or don't get lung disease or anything like that. So even though I smoke, it's not that big a deal because I might not develop any health problems from it anyway. So it's kind of minimizing the importance of the conflict. And a fifth strategy that we have to reduce cognitive dissonance is to do something called reducing your perceived choice. So let's imagine that you think you're the healthiest person in the world and you don't smoke at all, let's say. And I go up to you and I put a cigarette in your hand and I put a gun to your head and say, smoke this cigarette or I'm going to shoot. Now, you're going to smoke that cigarette and you are not going to feel guilty about it later on, right? Because you are forced to do it. You're not going to feel guilty about being forced to do something like that. So this is the strategy where if you can convince yourself that you are actually forced to engage in that behavior, then you don't have to feel personally responsible for having done it. You don't have to feel guilty. You don't have to experience this cognitive dissonance, in other words. So for instance, what you might say in this case is that you smoke, but you consider yourself a healthy person, but you might say, you know what, I had no choice in the matter because everyone else was smoking. They go out on smoke breaks. And while they're out there, while they're on their smoke break, they're talking about me, they're gossiping. If I'm not going to be there as well, they're going to talk about me and I can't let that happen. I have to go with them on the smoke break. So effectively, you're convincing yourself that you had no choice in the matter. And for a lot of these behaviors that produce this cognitive dissonance, we do in fact have a choice in the matter. But if we can convince ourselves that we were forced into it, then we no longer have to feel all that guilty for it. By the way, I've gotten a message that my internet connection's a bit unstable. So if there's any problems, if there's stuttering with the video, let me know and I can try to change my Wi-Fi network. I'm not going to do that unless people mention there's an issue, but if there is any issue with that, let me know. I'll do that. Okay, so this is what cognitive dissonance theory is all about. It's all about the strategies, the psychological mechanisms we have to try to reduce our dissonance when our behavior doesn't match our attitudes. And as I mentioned, you can see that a lot of these strategies have to do with sort of lying to ourselves or sort of deluding ourselves a little bit, right? Like convincing ourselves that smoking isn't unhealthy, or convincing ourselves that smoking actually is healthy because it helps us to lose weight, or convincing ourselves that we were forced to smoke in this case. So there's a lot of sort of self-delusion going on. Now, we can think about three general domains in which we see a lot of cognitive dissonance effects, okay? We're gonna talk about each of these in turn, and we're gonna start by looking at how we've already described cognitive dissonance, which is when we engage in a behavior that conflicts with our attitudes and we have to justify that behavior somehow, okay? So that's called justifying attitude discrepant behavior. Justifying our behaviors that are discrepant with our attitudes. That's how we've talked about cognitive dissonance so far. We're going to look a little bit more at that in a little bit more detail. Once we do that, we're going to look at two other domains in which we see a lot of cognitive dissonance as well. One of those domains is in terms of justifying effort. So there's a lot of situations where you've got to expend a lot of effort in order to join a group, for instance. And we're going to see how when we do that, when we expend effort to join a group, we've got to justify the fact that we've spent all that effort, which leads to a lot of cognitive reduction strategies, as we're going to see. And a third domain in which we see cognitive dissonance effects is when we have to justify difficult decisions. Okay, there's a lot of situations in which we've got to decide between one of two things. And under those conditions, that can lead to a lot of cognitive dissonance that arises, which we're then motivated to reduce. So we're going to come back to points 2 and 3 a little bit later, but I want to go into more depth by looking at point 1, the idea that we want to justify our attitude discrepant behavior. And to do so, and by the way, I see there's a question in the chat. Why is it attitude, not behavior? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. If you want to expand upon that question, I can answer that question. I'm just not quite sure what you mean by that question. In the meantime, okay, great. What I want to do is talk about the original study that showed cognitive dissonance effects. As I said, Leon Festinger is the guy who came up with cognitive dissonance theory. He did the study in the late 50s with a colleague of his. And this is a really, really, really famous study in social psychology. And it's the first study to show these cognitive dissonance effects and this tendency to sort of lie to ourselves. So here's the basic idea. So I'm going to walk you through this as if you're a participant in the study. Okay, so imagine that you sign up for a study and you show up to my lab. I'm the researcher. You show up to my lab and I tell you that what you're going to be doing, I'm going to place you in a room by yourself. And for the next half hour, here's what you're going to be doing. I give you this board, and on this board are a bunch of pegs. Now, what your job is I have a box here, and this box is filled with spools of thread. And what you've got to do is that with one hand and one hand only, you're going to reach into that box, you're going to pick up a spool of thread, and you're going to put it on a peg on the board. Then you're going to go back, you're going to pick up another spool of thread, you're going to put it on another peg. And you're going to repeat that process over and over until all the pegs have spools of thread on them. And then when you're done, you're going to take that first spool of thread, you're going to take it off the peg and put it back in the box. You're going to go to the second spool of thread, pick it up, put it back in the box. And you're going to repeat that until all the spools of thread are back in the box. And then when you're done that, you're going to repeat that process again and again and again. And for 30 mind-numbing minutes, you perform one of the most boring tasks you could possibly imagine. Okay? Then finally, after 30 minutes, I come to rescue you. And you're thinking, thank God, I can't take any more of this. It's so boring. And I come to you and I say, okay, now you're here for part 2. Here's what part 2 of the study is. I've got another board here. And on this board, there's like some shapes cut out, holes, like a square hole, a star hole, a circle hole, a triangle hole. And I got another box here. And on this box, there's little shapes with pegs on them. And so what I want you to do is that the first hole, let's say it's a square, I want you to find the square peg. You're going to pick it up, you're going to drop it in the hole. And the second hole, let's say it's a triangle hole, you're going to find the triangle peg, you're going to pick that up, you're going to drop that in the hole. And you're going to do that for all the holes on this board with one hand and one hand only. And then when you're done, you're going to take the first one, you're going to pick the shape up, you're going to drop it in the box. You go pick the second one up, drop it in the box. You're going to repeat that until all the pegs are off that board. And then when you're done that, you're going to do the whole thing again and again and again. And for another excruciating 30 minutes, that is all you do. So you spend an hour, in other words, engaged in like the most boring task you could possibly think of. You hate this study, in other words. Okay, and that's going to be key for later. Okay, at this point, I tell you, thank you for participating, and let me tell you what the study's about. I go into debriefing. In fact, the study's only beginning, but you think it's ending, okay? But it's only just beginning. Because at this point in time, I randomly assign you to one of 3 conditions. In the first control condition, what I do is I tell you that what the study is looking at is the effect of motivation on performance. So half of the people prior to doing the study got a motivating statement telling them how much fun the study was. The other half of the people didn't get that statement. You were in that second condition. You didn't get any motivating statement. But we want to know if that motivating statement helps people's performance. So that's what we're doing. Now, before I let you go from the study, the university is asking me to collect some data about how useful these sorts of studies are. So I have a little questionnaire for you. If you can fill out this questionnaire, that'd be great. And in that questionnaire are a number of questions that relate to how interesting the participants found the study. Okay, that's the control condition. The other 2 conditions are a little bit more interesting. Here's how they go. So as I'm explaining to you, as I'm debriefing you about what the study's about, I tell you it's about the effect of these motivating statements on performance. Once I'm finished telling you that, I get a phone call in the other room and I leave and I take the phone call and I come back a minute later and I tell you this. I say, we've got a bit of a problem here. So the person on the phone, that was a research assistant of mine. And they're supposed to be here, well, I mean, right now, basically. But they had car problems and they couldn't make it. So they're not going to be able to come in to help me with the study. The problem is that the next participant is in the waiting room right now, is ready to be run through the study. And I don't have an RA to run them through the study, which is a problem because that next participant, they're in the condition in which they're supposed to receive a motivating statement. In other words, the research assistant of mine was supposed to come in and tell them how much fun this study is. And now I don't have that person to do that. So I'm in a bit of a bind here. And so I'm wondering if you would be willing to help me out. Would you be willing to go into the waiting room and talk to that participant and tell them how much fun the study is? In other words, what I'm asking you to do is to lie, basically, right? Now, I don't say it like that, but what I'm asking the participant to do is lie, okay? So I want you to tell that person how much fun the study is. And if you do it, if you are willing to do this, I'll pay you $1. Okay. Now, even in the 1950s, $1 is not that much, especially if I'm asking you to basically lie to someone and I'm paying you $1 for it. That's not a whole lot of money, right? Like, are you willing to sell your soul for $1? Whatever. But regardless, you know, most people, they want to be helpful, and so they agree to help out the experimenter. Basically, everyone agrees to help out the experimenter. Okay. Now that's one of the conditions. Okay. And in the third condition, I go through the exact same process, except with one change. And I say this, I say, if you are willing to go in the next room and tell the next participant how much fun the study is, I will pay you $20 to do so. Okay. So if you're in one of those last two conditions, so in other words, you're told that you're either going to be paid $1 or $20 to lie to that person. Okay, if you're in one of those two conditions, you go into that next room, the waiting room, and you see a participant there, and you start talking to them, and they ask you, "So, how is the study? Is it fun? Is it interesting?" And you say, "You know what? It actually is quite interesting. I just did it. I had a really good time." And you are lying through your teeth, right? You hated the study, but you're telling them how much fun it is, right? You had a great time, and they say, "You know what? My roommate said it wasn't really fun at all. They said it was really boring." And you say, "No, don't listen to them. It's a really, really fun study." Okay. Okay, so after you tell the next person how much fun the study is, you come back to the researcher, to the experimenter, to me, and I say, okay, now the university is trying to collect some data on how much fun or how interesting, how useful these studies are. So if you can fill out this questionnaire, and you fill out the same questionnaire I described before that has measures on how interesting you found the study, et cetera, et cetera. And what the researcher wants to know is this: which group of people will come to convince themselves that, in fact, they actually liked this horrendously boring study, and why? Okay? Now, if you were to ask people prior to 1959, which group of people would come to convince themselves they really liked the study? The people who were paid $1 to lie, or the people who were paid $20 to lie? What people would have said is, well, if you're paid $20 to lie, well, we like getting $20. And so obviously, if you're paid $20 to lie, you'll convince yourself you really like the study because you're associating it with money. You got $20. What Festinger and Carl Smith predicted was the exact opposite. What they predicted is that the people who were paid $20 to lie, they would think the study is really boring. But the people who were paid $1 to lie would come to convince themselves that the study was actually interesting. Let's look at what they actually found, and then let's look at the explanation for that. So what we're looking at here is participants' ratings of how much fun or how enjoyable they found this study. Okay, that was supposedly on this university questionnaire, right? In fact, of course, it's just a questionnaire for the experimenter. So these are the three conditions: people who never lied to another person, people who were paid $20 to lie, people who were paid $1 to lie. So if you look first at the no-lie condition, the control condition, these people rightly said that they hated the task, right? This bar is really, really low. That means they did not find the task enjoyable at all. It was incredibly boring. Okay, that's our control condition. If you look at the people who were paid $20 to lie, they also basically say, yeah, this was really, really boring. They're a little bit higher than the no lie condition, but not much. They're still saying it's a really, really boring task. They really did not enjoy it at all. If you look at the people who were paid $1 to lie, suddenly they actually enjoyed the study. They report that the study was kind of fun, that they'd be willing to do it again, that they had a good time doing it. But how can that be the case? I mean, they engaged in the same task as the no lie, the control people, right? It was mind-numbingly boring for an hour. Why is it that they came to convince themselves they actually liked it? It's not because they were trying to impress other people, because no one else was going to see their responses to this questionnaire. What happened is that they came to convince themselves that, in fact, they actually liked the study. This is that sort of self-delusion aspect of cognitive dissonance that I talked about, right? So why did they do that? Well, let's think about this for a little bit, okay? These participants presumably have an attitude which is something like, I'm an honest person. I don't like to lie. Okay? And yet, they engaged in a behavior in which they did, in fact, lie to someone else. Their attitude and their behavior didn't match, right? I'm not someone who lies. I just lied to someone. That's going to create cognitive dissonance, right? But here's the thing. If you look at the people who are paid $20 to lie, yeah, they're kind of hypocritical, right? I mean, they engaged in a behavior that conflicted with their attitudes. But you know what? They were paid $20 to do so, and they're willing to be a little hypocritical for $20. Okay? They're okay with the fact that they went against their attitude a little bit. They lied even though they think they're an honest person. They're okay that they did that because they were paid enough to do so. There was enough of a justification that already existed for why they engaged in that behavior. Because of that, yeah, it creates a little bit of cognitive dissonance that they lied, but they're okay with it, okay? Because they're okay with it, they don't feel a need to reduce it, so they can accurately report that they actually didn't like the study. But imagine the people who are paid $1 to lie. Okay? Imagine that you think you're an honest person. You don't like to lie to other people, and you just lied to someone. You went against your values, and you're only paid $1 to do it. You can't say I did it for the money because you're only paid $1, right? So now you're starting to worry, my God, am I really this much of a hypocrite? Was I really willing to sell my soul for $1? Like for $20, okay, but for $1? And so that creates this massive amount of cognitive dissonance. These participants are now in a position where they've got to somehow justify, why did I just engage in that behavior? That's going to conflict with my attitudes. And they start thinking, you know what? Maybe I didn't really realize this before, but you know what? Now that I think about it, I actually kind of like the study. Actually, I really like the study. And if they can convince themselves that, in fact, they really like the study, then, in fact, their behavior was not inconsistent with their attitudes. Their attitude is that I like the study. Their behavior is that I told them how much I like the study. It's completely consistent, right? So what happened, in other words, is that these $1 lie people, the people who are paid $1 to lie, experienced this cognitive dissonance, which they couldn't justify by pointing to the money. So they had to justify it themselves. And they justified it themselves by convincing themselves they actually liked the study. Again, this is not them simply lying on the questionnaire. This is them actually believing that the study was really fun because they justified their behavior by convincing themselves of that. Okay, so the key here, the difference between the $20 lie and the $1 lie people, is that the $20 lie people had an external reason for why they engaged in that behavior. They had a pre-existing justification, in other words, and therefore they didn't have to justify it themselves. But the $1 lie people, they didn't have a pre-existing justification, and therefore they needed to justify it themselves, which they did by convincing themselves they actually liked the study. Okay, so this is the first study that showed this cognitive dissonance effect. And the whole study hinges on the difference between sufficient versus insufficient justification. So let's start with sufficient justification. The idea here is that the greater the reward, the greater the amount of money in this specific case that participants were paid to lie, the less likely attitude was to change. In other words, if people had a pre-existing justification, an external justification, they got money for why they engaged in this behavior, then they didn't feel a need to justify it themselves. Okay, so the greater the reward, the less they changed their attitudes because they had sufficient justification. They already had justification for why they behaved a bit like hypocrites because they did it for money. So, in other words, there are many situations in which we will act in a way, will behave in a way that contradicts our attitudes, but we did it for a tangible reason. We can point to a very specific reason for why we did it. So, for instance, you might think of yourself as a really, really honest person. And yet we know that people lie all the time. Maybe your friend asks you, how do you like my new pair of jeans that I got? And in reality, you don't like them at all, but she already bought them. You're not going to insult her. So you say, yeah, I like your jeans. I like them, right? Now you're lying technically, right? But you know why you're doing it. You're lying because you want to protect your friend's feelings. And that's a good reason to lie potentially in this case, right? So what that means is that you have sufficient justification. You have a pre-existing reason for why you're lying. Because of that, you don't feel a need to justify why you had to lie to your friend. It doesn't produce cognitive dissonance, in other words, when you have sufficient justification. And so, yeah, this is equivalent to the $20 example. The people who were paid $20 had sufficient justification, the $20, for why they lied to this person. Right? Or maybe you are getting married, and let's say you have a bunch of bridesmaids, or actually, let's say a friend of yours is getting married, and you are one of the bridesmaids, and she gives you a dress to try on, and you try on your bridesmaid dress, and you come out, and when you get out, it looks something like this, and your friend asks you, hey, how do you like your bridesmaid dresses? And you grit your teeth, and you say, oh, I love this dress, and of course, this dress is awful. You hate this dress, right? But you lie because you want to protect your friend's feelings. So there are many situations in which we'll act in ways that contradict our attitudes, that contradict our beliefs, and it doesn't produce cognitive dissonance if we have sufficient justification for our behavior. Of course, the opposite of sufficient justification is having insufficient justification. As the name implies, this means that you acted against your attitude and you don't really have a good reason for why you did it. You have an insufficient justification for it. Okay, you acted contrary to your attitudes for no tangible reason. So this is the equivalent of people in the $1 condition who are paid to lie. They lied, which went against their attitude, and they couldn't point to the money because it's only $1. So there's no real external reason for why they did it. And it's under these conditions, when we have insufficient justification, that we now have to try to convince ourselves that in fact our behavior was not really inconsistent with our attitudes. So it's only if you have insufficient justification that you might experience cognitive dissonance, and therefore will engage in one of those 5 strategies that I listed before to try to reduce your cognitive dissonance. Now, remember, I listed 5 strategies, right? So you could change your attitude, you could change your behavior, you can minimize the importance of the conflict, you do all these things. In this study, the participants specifically chose to reduce their dissonance by changing their attitude to match their behavior. In theory, they could have chosen any of the other mechanisms as well. But the easiest way they had to reduce their cognitive dissonance was to change their attitudes. And so that's what they tended to do. So these people came to convince themselves that their behavior wasn't inconsistent with their attitudes because, in fact, they really liked the study. Okay, so the takeaway here is that we experience cognitive dissonance if we have insufficient justification for our attitude discrepant behavior, but not if we have sufficient justification for our attitude discrepant behavior. So with that in mind, we want you to consider the following question. Okay, so some researchers wanted to test this idea. So what they did is they conducted a study with Army recruits. And the reason they used Army recruits is because they wanted people to eat a grasshopper, and they couldn't make students do it. Like, we can't make you guys eat grasshoppers in our labs, right? For ethical reasons, we obviously can't do that. But you can get away with a lot more with Army recruits. And so the researchers went to Army recruits, and they basically had either a well-liked officer ask them to eat a grasshopper, or a not well-liked officer ask them to eat a grasshopper. So in other words, either someone they liked asked them to eat a grasshopper, or someone they didn't like asked them to eat a grasshopper. Now, they're used to doing what they're told. So everyone did this. Everyone ate a grasshopper. And afterwards, they were asked how much did they enjoy eating that grasshopper. Now, in reality, most people don't like eating grasshoppers, right? So their attitude is, I don't like eating grasshoppers. Their behavior is that I ate a grasshopper. There's a conflict there. That's going to tend to produce dissonance, which people might reduce by convincing themselves that, in fact, they actually kind of liked eating a grasshopper. And so the question is, which of these two groups of people are going to convince themselves that they actually liked eating a grasshopper? Is it going to be the people who were asked by someone they like, or the people who were asked by someone they didn't like? Well, what the researchers believed was this. If you're an army recruit and you're asked to eat a grasshopper by someone you like, and you do it, okay, yeah, your behavior goes against your attitudes, that you don't like eating grasshoppers, but you ate one. But you have sufficient justification for why you did so. You did so out of a favor for this person that you liked. They asked you to do it. To do them a favor, you ate that grasshopper. Doing someone a favor is a good enough reason for why my behavior conflicted with my attitudes, right? You had sufficient justification. Therefore, there's no cognitive dissonance that aroused or that came up. And so you didn't feel a need to justify it. So those people, the people who were asked to eat a grasshopper by someone they liked, they correctly stated that, you know what, I really didn't like eating that grasshopper at all. But now if we look at the second group of people, people who were asked by someone they didn't like, all these people ate a grasshopper. But now when they're asked, how much did you like eating the grasshopper? Well, let me think, well, why did I just eat that grasshopper? I didn't do it out of a favor to this person who asked me, because I don't even like them. I wouldn't do a favor to someone I don't like. So it wasn't because of a favor. So why would I eat the grasshopper? Well, you know, okay, you know what? Actually, you know what? I actually kind of liked eating the grasshopper. I actually enjoyed it. That's why I did it. It wasn't a favor to them. It's because I actually enjoyed doing it. So the people in that group justified their behavior because they had insufficient justification, right? They didn't have a pre-existing reason for why they would have done it. So they came to convince themselves that they ate the grasshopper because, in fact, they actually liked it. And there are a ton of implications of these basic findings that I've just laid out for you. I'll give you a few, but there's like, I mean, we can come up with dozens and dozens or even hundreds of potential implications, but here's a few of them. Some researchers wanted to see if they can leverage this idea in order to try to increase the likelihood that people will use condoms in their own sexual practices. So what they did was the following. They brought students into a lab, and they told them that they were going to be giving a speech on the importance of using condoms. And they were told that the speech they're going to be given was either going to be just recorded for the purposes of this study. No one else was going to see it except the experimenter. Or they're told that it was going to be shown to high schools around the country. Okay? So everybody gives a speech about the importance of using condoms. It's all recorded. And then afterwards, the researcher says, well, thank you for doing that. As a token of our appreciation, what I have here, I've actually got a bowl of condoms here. If you want to take some, just feel free to take as many as you want. And then just to make sure the participant's not embarrassed to take some, the researcher leaves the room. The participant then takes some condoms and leaves the experiment. But the researcher knew how many condoms were in the bowl in the first place. So when they go back in, they can simply count how many are left, and with a simple process of subtraction, they can figure out how many condoms the participant took. Now, the idea here was they were trying to get people to be more likely to use condoms, to take more condoms, using the following logic. If you give a speech saying that it's really important to always use condoms in your sexual practices, right? If you give that speech, and then in your own personal life, you don't use condoms, you practice unsafe sex, right? Well, your attitude, your behavior are sort of in conflict. That's going to produce some dissonance, right? So to avoid that cognitive dissonance, what you might do is once you've stated what your attitude is, you might then take more condoms on the way out in order to avoid the dissonance that would be created if you didn't yourself use condoms after just giving a speech about using condoms. But the critical idea here is that if you are giving this speech and you think that speech is going to be shown to high school kids all around the country, it's very public. You are publicly stating your attitude. And a public commitment is going to be much stronger It's going to be much more likely to produce dissonance if you don't behave consistently with that. So what the researchers had predicted is that those people who were told that this speech about why you should always use condoms was going to be shown to all these high school kids, those people should be much more likely to take condoms, because otherwise they're going to have a lot of cognitive dissonance if they don't use condoms themselves, compared to people who were told the speech was only going to be shown to the experimenter. In that case, you're not really making a public commitment to an attitude. And so it's not going to really, you're not going to feel all that bad if you don't use condoms in your own daily life. Right? And so that's basically what they showed, is that people who gave a speech who believed it was going to be shown to high school kids themselves ended up taking more condoms when they left the study, in order to avoid the cognitive dissonance that would be created if they themselves didn't use condoms after giving that speech. And the researchers followed up with these participants like 2 or 3 months later. And the people who were in that condition, in the condition where they gave this public speech, or they believed it was going to be public, they actually reported using condoms more in their own sex life compared to students who gave a speech that they were told was only going to be private. Okay? So we can sort of leverage these ideas of cognitive dissonance in order to get people to engage in healthier behaviors. That's effectively what the researchers showed here. There is something called the Ben Franklin effect as well, which it's so called because it was used by Benjamin Franklin way before we had any idea of what cognitive dissonance was. In retrospect, now that we know what it was, we understand that what he did is he actually used some cognitive dissonance principles. So let me explain to you what the Benjamin Franklin effect is. So Ben Franklin had some enemies in the legislature, okay? And we're talking about like hundreds of years ago, right? So Benjamin Franklin had some enemies. He's like a politician, right? He has some enemies in the legislature, and he wanted to try to convert them into friends. And now normally we might think that if you have someone who doesn't like you and you want to make them a friend, we might want to do them favors, do nice things for them to convince them we're a nice person, right? That's sort of the strategy that most of us would take. But not Benjamin Franklin, okay? He was kind of clever. What he figured is that if you want to turn an enemy into a friend, you don't do them favors. You get them to do a favor for you. Here's the idea. So he knew that this guy that was an enemy of his, this guy had a big library. So he goes up to this guy, his enemy, and he says, hey, you have a big library. I'm trying to get a hold of this certain book, and I know you must have it in your library. Would you be willing to loan that to me for a week? And his enemy sort of, okay, fine. And he loans him a book for a week. And then Benjamin Franklin returns it at the end of the week. And at that point forward, they became friends. What happened here? The psychological trick is sort of so subtle you may not have even picked up on it. But the idea is this: put yourself into Benjamin Franklin's enemy's shoes. So Benjamin Franklin comes up to you. You don't like this guy. And he asks you for a favor. He asks you to borrow a book from your library. Okay, fine. It requires minimal effort. So you loan a book to him and he returns it later on, right? Now, in your mind, your attitude is that I don't like Benjamin Franklin. But your behavior is, I just did Benjamin Franklin a favor. Those things don't really match, right? You don't do favors for your enemies. So your attitude and your behavior are in conflict. And that's going to produce some cognitive dissonance, right? Like, why would you have loaned a book to an enemy? Well, that's kind of making you feel uncomfortable. And then you start thinking, you start rationalizing and justifying. You start thinking, you know what? Actually, now that I think about it, you know what? I actually kind of like Benjamin Franklin. He's actually kind of a friend of mine. And after all, if he's a friend of mine, then me loaning him a book is not discrepant with my attitude. It's very much consistent, right? So what he did is, to justify his behavior of loaning his enemy a book, he convinced himself that he actually liked Benjamin Franklin. Okay? And so there's sort of the general strategy here, as I mentioned before, is that if you want someone, if there's a person that you want to become friends with, okay, it's oftentimes better, instead of doing them favors, is you get them to do a favor for you, at which point they will have to justify why they did that favor for you, which they might do by convincing themselves that they actually like you. Okay, so that's how Benjamin Franklin basically leveraged cognitive dissonance effects to create a friend out of an enemy. Okay, here's a third example of justifying behavior. So in this study, what researchers did is they went to a classroom. These were like grade school kids. And they administered a questionnaire that had a bunch of questions, including one of them that asked them what their attitude was towards cheating. Now, Some people have very negative attitudes. Some people are fine with it. Most people are somewhere in the middle, right? That, it's not, you shouldn't do it. It's not like the worst thing you can do, just cheat on a test, but you shouldn't do it, right? It's still kind of wrong. What the researchers did is they had the teacher administer an actual test to the kids and leave the room such that the kids were able to cheat if they wanted to, but they were secretly being video recorded. And so the researchers could identify which of these kids cheated and which kids didn't cheat. After that, the researchers come back in and re-administer that initial questionnaire that asked them their attitudes towards cheating. And that's what I'm going to display here. Okay, so these are the kids' self-reported attitudes towards cheating. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to divide the kids into two groups: the kids who would eventually cheat on the actual test that the teacher gave, and the kids who didn't cheat on the test the teacher gave. Now, obviously, before that test was administered, we didn't know who was going to be a cheater or not. But after it was administered, we knew, so we can go back and sort of divide the students up into these two groups. And so what they showed is that the kids who would eventually end up cheating and the kids who would eventually end up not cheating prior to that test had about the same attitudes towards cheating. They're, again, as I said, sort of moderately negative. You shouldn't do it, but it's not the worst thing in the world. But what's really interesting is that once you place these kids in a situation where they're able to cheat, and some cheat and some don't, and then you re-administer this questionnaire about their attitude towards cheating, their attitudes undergo a very marked shift. So if you look at the cheaters, what happens is that the cheaters all of a sudden get much more positive towards cheating if they themselves had just cheated. And the students who didn't cheat, they all of a sudden get much less positive. They get much more negative towards cheating than they were ahead of time. Okay, what's happening here? Well, imagine you're a cheater, okay? And I ask you, after a test on which you have just cheated, what is your attitude towards cheating? Well, if you say that cheating is wrong and you just cheated, well, your behavior and attitude don't match. It's going to produce a lot of cognitive dissonance, right? So what you do is you have to justify your prior behavior. You just cheated, right? Well, but now I think, but cheating is really not a big deal at all. Like, everyone cheats. No one cares if you cheat. Cheating is really not a big deal at all, right? So you justified your past cheating behavior by convincing yourself that cheating is actually okay. Meanwhile, the non-cheaters are in the opposite situation. They were just in a situation where they could have cheated, but they didn't, right? And so when they're later asked, what's your attitude towards cheating, they've basically got to justify why they didn't cheat when they were given the opportunity, which they do so by saying, well, that's because cheating is just horribly wrong. It's like the worst thing you could possibly do. That justifies why they didn't cheat a minute ago when they had the opportunity to. So this is a great example of what I mentioned at the beginning of this section, when one of the main ideas behind cognitive dissonance is that the behaviors we engage in can change the attitudes we develop. And that's what we're seeing here. The very act of cheating led these people to develop more positive attitudes towards cheating. And the very act of not cheating led these students to develop more negative attitudes towards cheating. So we develop these attitudes, in other words, to justify the past behaviors we've engaged in. Okay, that's what I meant when I said that not only do our attitudes lead to our behaviors, but the behaviors we engage in change the attitudes that we develop. I'll give you one more example of a justifying behavior here. And this has to do with punishments. And this, again, these findings are sort of counterintuitive of what we would normally think. But let me describe to you the study, and then we'll get to that in a second. Okay, so imagine a study where we're going to do the study with kids, okay? And what we're going to do is, for each kid, there's going to be like a playroom, and they're allowed to use a bunch of whatever toys they want to in this playroom, with one exception. There's this one toy in this playroom that they're told they're not allowed to play with. Now, I don't know what the toy was. We can pretend it's this robot thing, because if I was a kid, that's what I would want to play with. But, well, let's be honest, I want to play with it as an adult. But regardless, let's just pretend that's the toy, okay? What happened, these are 5-year-old kids, okay? So what they're told is that they're allowed to play with anything in the room except this one forbidden toy. And the way that they're told that is under one of two conditions. So the kids are randomly assigned to be told one of two things. So some of the kids are given a mild threat. They're told, look, I'm going to leave the room for a minute. You're going to be by yourself. Remember that toy over there. You're not allowed to play with that. please do not play with that toy. This is a very, very mild threat. The other group of kids are in a severe threat condition. They're told something like, in a minute, I'm going to leave this room. And remember, you're not allowed to play with that toy. And if you do, you are going to be in such big trouble, right? So kind of a much more severe threat, right? So the researcher leaves, but they can like secretly monitor if the kids are playing with the toy. None of the kids play with the toy, right? They all obey the rules. None of the kids play with the toy. The researcher comes back and then asks the kids, how much do you want to play with this toy right now? How much do you like that toy? What they show is that the kids who are in the mild threat condition have come to convince themselves that in fact, they don't want to play with this toy at all, compared to kids in the severe threat condition who still want to play with this toy. Now, what's happening here? What happened? Well, what happened is this. Imagine that you're one of these kids, okay, and you really like this toy. You want to play with this robot, right? And the researcher says, if you play with that toy, you're going to be in such big trouble. Okay, fine. So you don't play with the toy. And when the researcher comes back and asks you how much you like the toy, well, yeah, I really want to play with it. I really, really like this toy. They still really want to play with this toy, right? But now put yourself into the mind of kids in the mild threat condition. These are kids who are told, please don't play with that toy. Now, I'm a good kid. I'm not going to play with that toy. And the researcher comes back and asks me, how much do you want to play with this toy? And I start thinking, how much do I want to play with this toy? Man, you know what? Like, I really want to play with it, but I didn't play with it a second ago and I had the opportunity to, right? Well, that's weird. That's going to create a lot of cognitive dissonance. My behavior doesn't match my attitude. So the kids are thinking, well, how much do I want to play with that toy? Well, you know what? Actually, you know, I never wanted to play with it. Actually, you know, I don't like robots. I don't want to play with that toy. And so what happened is they came to convince themselves that the reason that they didn't play with the toy is because they didn't want to, right? By convincing themselves that they didn't actually like that toy, then they could avoid the cognitive dissonance that would have been created if they had to admit that they really wanted to play with the toy, but they didn't, right? The difference here goes back to the sufficient justification idea. The kids in the severe threat condition had a good reason for why their behavior conflicted with their attitude. In other words, for why they didn't play with the toy even though they wanted to, because they were going to get really strongly punished, right? That's sufficient justification. And as we saw earlier, if you have sufficient justification, you don't feel cognitive dissonance. You don't feel bad about engaging in that behavior, right? So they correctly said that they still really wanted to play with the toy. But the kids in the mild threat condition, they had insufficient justification for why they didn't play with the toy. They didn't have a good reason for why they were like the people in the $1 condition in the original study, right? They engaged in a behavior that was against their attitudes, but they couldn't point to any external reason why, right? After all, it was only a mild threat, so they couldn't point to the threat as the reason. So these people experienced cognitive dissonance. These people had to convince themselves that they didn't actually want to play with the toy in the first place. This has some really important implications, especially if you think of something like raising children, because we think most of the time, or most people think that if you want to, let's say you want to keep your kid from doing something. Let's say you don't want them to drink when they're underage, right? We often think that the best way to do that is to give them severe threats. If you touch a drop of alcohol, so help me God, you're going to be in trouble, right? What this study shows and what cognitive dissonance theory shows is that that's the exact opposite of what you should be doing. Or I shouldn't say the exact opposite, but what you should be doing is giving only a mild threat, right? If you give people a mild threat, like, you know, I would really like that you don't touch alcohol, I'll be disappointed in you, or something along those lines. That mild threat is much more effective at actually changing people's internal attitudes, because your child might think, they might refrain from drinking alcohol if you give them a severe threat, but they still know that they really want to drink, right? But the kids in the mild threat condition, as long as the mild threat is still strong enough to get them to stop drinking, okay, they're going to start thinking, well, why did I not drink at that party when I had the chance to? I mean, it wasn't because, obviously it wasn't because of the threat that, you know, my parent gave me, because that was only mild. Why did I not? Oh, you know, it's probably because, you know what it is? It's because I don't really want to drink in the first place. That's why I did it. So to justify their behavior, they change their internal attitudes. This is why mild threats produce better outcomes than severe threats when we're talking about punishing, which is kind of the exact opposite of how we normally think about it. Okay, We have 5 minutes. Let's have a quick quiz. So let's jump on to Top Hat right now. And we'll pick up there with cognitive dissonance for next class. Oops. Okay, so this is quiz number 5. These are 5 questions that have to do with attribution. I think there's one on attribution and the others are on attitudes, I believe. Okay, so first question on attributions. So people from Western cultures, so like the US, learn to make more and more of which kind of attributions as they grow up? Do they make more and more situational attributions, dispositional attributions, contextual attributions, or external attributions? What do we learn? What kind of attributions do we learn to make in Western cultures? We got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we've seen that in Western cultures. Whoops, what did I just do here? Sorry guys, hold on one second. There we go. So we've seen that in Western cultures. We learn to make a lot of internal attributions. We explain people's behavior in terms of their personality. 3 of these terms refer to external attributions, so obviously external does. Contextual and situational would all be explaining people's behavior in terms of their environment. Dispositional is the one where we explain people's behavior in terms of their personality, and dispositional is the correct response there. Question number 2. Most attitude researchers believe that attitudes have 3 components. These components are which of the following? Is it implicit, explicit, and intrinsic, general, aggregated, and specific, operational, social, comparative, and genetic, or affective, behavioral, and cognitive? Got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, so we talked about the ABCs of the self and also the ABCs of attitudes. That stands for affective, behavioral, and cognitive. Good. Question number 3. Implicit attitudes can be difficult to measure because why? A, people are not aware of having them. B, they can only be measured by direct techniques. C, they become aggregated over time. Or D, they are prone to the effects of social desirability. At 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, so I mentioned how implicit attitudes are the attitudes that we're not even aware of having, which obviously then makes them difficult to measure. So A is the correct answer. Question number 4, we talked about this today. The purpose of a bogus pipeline is to do which of the following? Is it to avoid confounds when manipulating the independent variable? Is it to reduce the likelihood of making the fundamental attribution error? Is it to reduce the likelihood that participants will lie about their attitudes? Or is it to reduce the amount of cognitive dissonance that people experience? We have 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, so we just talked about this today. And so the purpose of a bogus pipeline, that's when people think they're hooked up to a fake lie detector, or well, they think they're hooked up to a lie detector test. But the reason we use it is to reduce the likelihood that participants will lie, which is option C. So great. And finally, question 5. So based on social psychological research about attitudes, which of the following statements is true? Is it that our attitudes and our behaviors are unrelated? Is it that our attitudes determine our behavior, but our behavior does not determine our attitudes? Is it that our behavior determines our attitudes, but our attitudes do not determine our behavior? Or is it that under certain circumstances, attitudes do predict behavior? Ten seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, so we looked at this. This was the main question in the attitude section that we addressed at the beginning of today's class. And what we saw is obviously D, under certain circumstances, attitudes that do predict behavior. So obviously for the exam, know what those conditions are. Okay, so that's it for today. Sorry, I'm going a couple minutes over there. Next class is the last class before the exam, and we are going to be having a quiz that class as well. So come prepared for that. I will see you guys then. Have a good night.